Lab 257 Part 08 by Michael C. Carroll. The Disturbing Story of the Government's Secret. Part 2. The Safest Lab in the World. 5. The Age of Science. Germs just don't have a chance. Secretary of Agriculture ZARA TAFT BENSON, 1956. Boundless optimism. No other phrase captures the feeling of 1950s America. The United States had saved the world from totalitarianism, and its mainland shores had not suffered the physical wreckage of war. Eisenhower, the revered general who had led the Normandy invasion and crushed Hitler and Nazi Germany, was now in the White House. Thousands of returning GIs were lured by the clean air, winding roads, freestanding homes, and manicured lawns of suburban communities, typified by Levittown, built on the wine potato flats of Long Island. Automobile sales skyrocketed and families drove in newfangled cars over freshly paved 6-lane interstate roads, pit-stopping at newly constructed drive-ins and burger joints. Television, that new miracle device, entertained and informed a swelling middle class, unshackled from the poverty of the Great Depression. The future had arrived. The jet age brought people to exotic lands and beaches in hours. Communication advances made it possible to telephone Europe from their homes instead of wiring telegrams, and men were being launched into space, and they came back alive. Throughout the medical world, scientists were taming germ infections with revolutionary chemicals called antibiotics, developed during the war by pioneers like chemist George W. Merck. Vaccinations were becoming available, miracle injections that prevented those infections from even starting. While rocket scientists were trying to put a man on the moon, biologists and virologists were fervently exploring the eradication of disease. Poliovirus, not long ago a terribly crippling disease, was being eradicated from the United States by Dr. Jonas Salk's new vaccine, and the spread of deadly tuberculosis was being controlled for the first time in history. Unbridled economic expansion brought on a voracious American appetite, consumption of beef sharply surpassed that of pork, and the demand for all foods grew exponentially. And like the NASA scientists, the USDA also promised the people the moon, a moon not only of cheese, but of milk, vegetables, grains, and meats. The total integration of scientific knowledge would be forcefully applied to agriculture, resulting in tremendously increased productivity of crops and animal products. Healthy animals were needed to produce wholesome food, to support America's high standard of living. The elimination of animal diseases not only meant a greater abundance of food, it prevented those diseases from jumping to man. Like Salk's success with polio, a massive outbreak of foot and mouth disease virus in Mexico in 1948 was triumphantly overcome, contained just miles from the U.S. border before harming America's food supply. Veteran USDA scientist Doc Shahan, assisted by Army Colonel Mace, led a 10,000-man campaign through the arid Mexican terrain to combat the outbreak there. Tall, lean, and tan, Doc Shahan had thick furrowed eyebrows and a black crew cut streaked with gray. Wherever he went, he carried with him a carved wood pipe and a pocket full of fresh tobacco. His talents, according to his friends, lay in his charm. Doc's demeanor was more gentleman country doctor than egg-headed scientist, and his suave charisma proved perfect for the task. Like the Allied generals who had slain totalitarianism in Europe 3 years earlier, Shahan and his men of modern science vanquished the disease and saved North America. They corralled the infected animals of Mexican peasants, quarantined the beasts of burden, and then either vaccinated or destroyed them en masse. Within 18 months they wiped the scourge clear off the continent, sparing America from outbreak and famine. But victory did not come without human cost. 24 Americans and hundreds of Mexicans died in the cause, in armed uprisings and brutal reprisals by Mexican villagers against the men of science. One proud of their victory, Doc Shahan and Colonel Mace returned to the States, yearning for a lab where they could continue to wage war against other virulent germs. Advanced science applied to food production would aid America's worldwide struggle of democracy over godless communism. History has indelibly written that revolution, anarchy, and tyranny are fellow travelers of hunger and malnutrition, one USDA scientist said. Our plans for the future must include a never-abundant supply of these foods if we want our people to be strong and our nation to endure. Science would make the difference in the battle between good and evil. The crown jewel of this blossoming, futuristic agricultural empire would be Plum Island. We meet today on the site of an old fortress. This island today is again an outpost of defense, against an enemy more menacing by far than the fleets of 1898. The enemy is real and the victory we seek is a victory for every human being in every farm, village, town, and city of the earth. Our grandparents built this country with the help of their animals. That was yesterday. Today, our farm economy pivots on animal agriculture. I firmly believe America is on the threshold of the most challenging and most prosperous decade the world has ever seen. This is the age of science and technology. The frontiers of the mind have replaced the frontiers of geography. Organized and imaginative research will push the scientific frontier beyond limits we scarcely dare dream today. Brains will continue to replace brawn in American agriculture and industry. Man will direct power rather than supply it. Brain power will be more important than horsepower. It was Dedication Day, and ZARA TAFT BENSON had the crowd on its feet. For years, Plum Island had been off-limits to the curious public, under the heavily armed guard of Army soldiers and uniformed federal officers. The mysterious nature of the island lair, once a popular summer paradise, began when the U.S. War Department closed its shores and chained its piers at the end of the 19th century. Tourists that flowed through Long Island Sound each summer, wrote the Suffolk Sun in 1895. In whose fancy there seem to be enchanted islands in ideal regions, ask 1,000 questions. What are they? Who dwells thereon? They gaze at it wistfully as if they would like to know more about it. Now, half a century later, feelings about Plum Island were no different. But today, on this sunny autumn morning, the gates were finally being flung open. Visitors came from near and far to walk the plank onto the 11 a.m. ferry to Plum Island on September 26, 1956. The laboratories had been washed down and polished up, the weeds pulled, the signs freshly painted. The employee union readied its outdoor table with cakes, cookies, and coffee. The island smelled of freshly cut grass mingled with sea salt. The germs had been locked away in vials in the vault drawers for 3 weeks now. Days before, green porters had noticed an uncommon buzz along Main Street, strangers darting in and out of shops, eating and drinking heartily at Claudio's and the Clam Bar out on the pier. Some had distinctive southern and western accents. Others spoke in foreign tongues. But all wore expressions of great anticipation. Locals opened their spare rooms, recently vacated at summer's end, to welcome them. A special ferry was arranged with the new London Freight Lines, the massive LSM transport craft that landed amphibious battalions on the shores of Okinawa during World War II a decade earlier would now land on Plum Island an excited throng of general public and VIPs. Plum Island scientists wearing patriotic red, white, and blue badges pinned to their lapels escorted local residents around the island and inside the heralded chalk-white laboratory. Members of local civic organizations came, too, from the Rotary Club, the Minnetonka Club, and the South Old Tuesday Morning Club, as did national agricultural associations and high school science teachers with their classes in tow. Master of ceremonies was new Plum Island director Doc Shahin, smartly dressed in a sharp two-button black suit, crisp white shirt, diagonally striped thin tie, and a handkerchief ironed into a square that peeked out of his breast pocket. Sitting in front of him, in the roped-off seating areas up front, were the VIPs, Plum Island's founding father, Dr. William A. Hagen, the island's former commanding officer, Army Colonel Donald Mace, top military brass from Fort Detrick, Maryland, and finally a slew of European research scientists. Among them was the director of West Germany's new state research laboratory at Tübingen, Erich Straub. After the Pledge of Allegiance and a robust singing of the national anthem, Dr. Hagen rose to give his remarks. To most of the audience, he was known as the Distinguished Dean of Cornell University's Veterinary School. But to a select few, he was an architect of America's biological warfare program, and the patriarch of anthrax as a weapon of war. Hagen spoke to the crowd about the lab's importance, and listeners nodded and smiled approvingly. But then he upbraided the local audience, who had initially opposed the lab and were only now beginning to accept it. Reopening old wounds, Hagen said, "Those of you who fear that germs will leak and harm your families are good but misled folk." Hagen exited the podium to tepid applause. "At first, the neighborhood wasn't in our favor," says Diana Fish, then the tender 20-year-old wife of scientist Dr. Ralph Fish. "They didn't want to accept us, we were ignored completely. Scientists and their families got together each week to socialize and play canasta and gin rummy. Sometimes villagers would cross the street or turn and walk in another direction when they saw Colonel Mace or Doc Shahin approaching Main Street. We were about as welcome as a moth in the garment district," Shahin later remembered. "These men had wonderful, wonderful minds," says Diana Fish. "They carried the banner of the United States through Mexico and were rewarded with Plum Island, and the public there was not hardly ready for it." Dedication Day, however, seemed to mark a turning point in relations. One Mrs. Halleck, from one of the area's oldest and most respected families, wrote Doc Shahin that the ceremonies and public tours were so right, so helpful in allaying and banishing latent fears at first held by the community, I being one of those fearful. The fact that you want to think of us as friends and neighbors means a great deal. We have pride in your work within, not outside of, our community." Doc Shahin thanked the VIP scientists for attending, careful not to name Colonel Mace and the Fort Detrick scientists. "We cannot say too much for the excellent cooperation the USDA has been given by the representatives of the Department of Defense," Doc penned in his first draft, praising Mace's vision for Plum Island, but such kudos remained on the cutting room floor, and the Army germ warfare men sitting in the audience understood, and accepted, the snub. After all, their involvement had to remain top secret. Dr. B.T. Sims spoke next, ordering Plum Island headlong into a brave new world. "We know we are facing days and weeks and years of hard work, but it will be work that we love," he exulted. "We can expect many disappointments, but we can expect them to be overshadowed by achievements." President Eisenhower's Secretary of Agriculture, Ezra Taft Benson, then delivered his captivating keynote address. The former Idaho potato farmer had visited Long Island earlier that year and spoke to local farmers at Riverhead, the farming village at the head of the North and South Forks, listening first to their concerns on crop supports and then their worries over Plum Island. The dapper, bespectacled Benson mounted the podium, crowned with the Department of Agriculture seal and framed by a long dais adorned in red, white, and blue bunting. With a cool breeze sweeping through the outdoor ceremony, the Mormon farmer roused the thousand-strong audience with impassioned, almost religious oratory. Doc Shahin, sitting to the right of the podium in the first seat, beamed at the secretary and out at the crowd, applauded Benson's powerful speech as the band played a majestic fanfare. The amiable director was overjoyed that his island laboratory had arrived. After the ceremony, Doc and his deputy, Dr. Jerry Callis, led Secretary and Mrs. Benson on a private tour down the lab corridors, pointing out laboratory rooms and animal rooms along the way. Benson gazed curiously down a chute in an animal room that led to the incinerator. Observing the tangle of decontamination machinery and pipes down the hallway that filter the air, he exclaimed out loud, to no one in particular. Germs just don't have a chance. On that intoxicating day, in the hands of such capable men, it certainly seemed that way. Outside, the doctors led the secretary to the lab's cornerstone, which he dedicated retroactively. It read simply, AD 1956. The breeze had picked up, pushed by the fast-approaching Hurricane Flossie. Benson bid them farewell, tipped his white derby to the crowd, and caught the ferry back to the mainland. The other guests were also quickly shuttled off the island, and Doc Shahin moved the inaugural scientific conference to Greenport High School. Flossie wasn't the first, and wouldn't be the last, storm to batter Plum Island, which lay squarely in the path of the East Coast Hurricane Corridor. Doc Shahin's Plum Island team consisted of a core of 3 scientists. Doc's most promising star, 34-year-old biochemist Dr. Howard L. Bachrach, had been the first to isolate the polio virus, working under the Nobel laureate Dr. Wendell M. Stanley. Obtaining Bachrach for Plum Island was so imperative, Shahin wooed him east with unheard-of perquisites, the opportunity to bring in his own biochemistry-biophysics team, and the chance to design his own research wing in the new island facility. The 52-year-old Nebraskan Shahin, a cowboy boot-wearing lab director, was a hard man to turn down. A reporter described him as tweedy in dress, handsome in a wide-open Western way. Doc Shahin likes people and people like him. Bachrach bit, but realized soon afterward that he got a little less than he had bargained for. This space is, of course, much less than I have recommended as a minimum, he later lamented. And it would help if, more, space becomes available in the basement. It never did. Shahin also drafted chief scientist Dr. Jacob Traum, who retired at the age of 74 from the University of California, also Bachrach's alma mater. Traum lent his reputation and immense knowledge to the fledgling facility as a world-renowned expert on tuberculosis and brucellosis. But the franchise player on Doc's team was the slim, blonde assistant director. At the tender age of 27, Dr. Jerry Callis was the youngest member of the Plum Island scientific staff. Callis graduated with honors from Purdue University and landed a USDA position studying animal germs overseas, where he was being groomed for the opening of a new laboratory. In a remarkable departure from the not-too-distant past, local newspapers provided glowing support. The Riverhead News Review, for example, commented, "Worthwhile research projects such as the Animal Disease Laboratory are in the best public interest and examples of useful expenditures of the taxpayers' money." 4 years after the locals strenuously opposed the building of the laboratory, folks were now in genuine support. It didn't hurt that almost overnight, Plum Island became the largest employer in the region, with over 300 workers making the ferry trip across Plum Gut each morning, all of them now receiving healthy federal government salaries and benefits. When the villagers' spouses, siblings, and children were hired by Plum Island, things quickly changed. I think people are beginning to appreciate that we know how to maintain the security over any infection leaving the island, said Shahin, and that a new industry has come to town and new money is being spent around here. This was all a relief to Doc Shahin and Jerry Callis, who had fought hard to build the island laboratory. With the support of their mentor, Dr. Hagen, the scientists' vision was at first grandiose, perhaps too much so in Congress's eyes, as lawmakers in Washington parsed through the Aggies' $30 million initial plan to build a 30-acre behemoth. "These people came up before the committee," said the Appropriations Committee Chairman, Jamie Whitten, "with the most fantastic plans for spending money and building a laboratory that you can imagine. It was entirely out of line. It looked like the Department of Agriculture might want a Pentagon building for itself. They ended up with a more modest, $10 million complex instead." Laboratory 101 was a pioneer effort in high-hazard biological agent containment. On that day in 1956, it appeared as a gleaming white monument. Lying on the northwest plateau of Plum Island, the lab is splayed over a 10-acre site just east of the old lighthouse. A steep cliff, towering high above huge boulders, forms a natural buttress against the churning waters at the confluence of the Long Island Sound and the Atlantic Ocean. This 164,000 square foot T-shaped structure, with all its intricate machinery, a cluster of twisting pipes and valves and boxes and gauges taking up the entire second floor, cost $7,712,000 to build. The USDA used the remainder of the $10 million in congressional funding for the supporting cast, the guardhouse entry gate, sewage decontamination building, emergency power plant, storage buildings, fencing to corral the herds of test animals outside, and the compound fences to envelop the lab building. The two 10-foot-high barbed wire, chain-link fences have a 20-foot buffer zone between them. The inner fence has a concrete barrier that extends 5 feet above ground and 4 feet below. Before 101 opened, the perimeter was scorched with chemicals to defoliate the area and deter vermin from approaching. Just west of 101, outside the compound fence, is building number 102, the wastewater treatment plant. Here, sewage is heat-treated to decontaminate it before it is piped into the Long Island Sound and Gardiner's Bay. Next door is building number 103, the emergency power plant and adjacent oil tank farm. The air that comes in and goes out, the water coming in, the sewage going out, all of it is controlled inside a master control room with large, glowing red and green buttons and throw switches mounted on the walls, and large panel grids each containing 35 small boxes that illuminate white with buzzer alarms. The top of 101's T is the clean zone, the main hallway and service area, offices, the sterilizing laundry, complete with sewing and mending equipment. The wide stem of the T is the hot zone, divided lengthwise into 3 segments. The 2 outer strips house 32 animal isolation rooms. Each room measures 10 feet by 15 feet, and a door, painted bright red, leads through change room airlocks into hot corridors, dimly lit by squat windows made of opaque glass bricks that refract light and cast shadows within. Together, the animal isolation rooms hold up to 75 head of cattle. The middle of the stem of the T, separated from the animal wings by an outdoor moat, holds a maze of laboratory rooms, divided into 4 research areas. Inside is all the heavy equipment, the electron microscope, ultraviolet irradiator, ultracentrifuge, egg incubators, virus fermenters, virus freezers, wall-to-wall glove boxes. The rooms are windowless, illuminated by fluorescent lights that cast a ghastly pallor over the glazed tile walls, cabinets, and metal benches upon which tissue cultures are grown, eggs embryonated, germs pipetted, sucked by mouth into a long glass tube, cells infected, antibodies produced, and so on. The big incubators don't hatch any chicks, they grow viruses in trays of eggs and provide embryo tissues for in vitro experiments. Inside the virus freezers are germs and a stockpile of animal and human tissues grown in the incubators alongside the chicken eggs. The ultracentrifuge spins to create a great force, thousands of times the Earth's gravitational force, which separates viruses from their infected host cell and other debris. At the base of the T is the incinerator charging room, where animal carcasses, organs, fluids, paper items, and other combustibles, even spent nuclear radiation, are reduced to fine ash at Earth-scorching temperatures. The smoke emitting from the PA within is flushed out through a filtered stack lined with afterburner jets. During the dedication day tours, every inch of this state-of-the-art facility was sparkling clean, but this didn't last long. After the audience left and the stage and podium were broken down, the curtain fell on Plum Island. Days later, splattered blood, animal waste, and remnants of internal organs were strewn across the freshly painted white walls and shiny floors of the animal rooms, transforming them into something more akin to torture chambers than science labs. Behind one room's airlock door, unsuspecting cows were restrained by a brawny animal handler wearing powder blue scrubs, then injected with a menu of germs that rendered the beasts incapacitated in a matter of hours. Inside another, goats were locked in stanchions, a hair's breadth from choking between two narrow metal bars snapped tightly into place around their necks. Another room held swarms of infected soft and hard ticks gorging on the blood of two pigs, and in still another, horses were bled for serum samples. The fauna came to Plum Island in a precise and peculiar manner. Test animals were periodically trucked in from a Virginia farm to Brookhaven National Laboratory, the Federal Atomic Energy Research Facility on Long Island. A special Plum Island truck picked them up and carted them to Orient Point, where the cattle car boarded the ferry for the bumpy ride across Plum Gut. Upon arrival at Plum Island Harbor, workers led the animals off the truck and through the gated animal transfer station. The animals were slipped into a squeeze gate, punch-tagged on the ear, and sprayed. They were led up ramps onto another truck, a permanent fixture on the island, which brought the animals to the old Army artillery bunkers where they were washed in a big vat, called a dipping, then quarantined for 2 weeks. Feed came in through an airlock, and a hammer mill that ground up any live insects or rodents that managed to burrow inside the burlap feed sacks. No person, vehicle, or animal could cross through the harbor gatehouse without a thorough decontamination. After an animal finished its quarantine, it was a one-way trip into the lab. There, 2 animal handlers ready to enter the animal's room. Adhering to strict safety procedures, they donned protective gear, 2-piece black rubber slickers, boots, rubber hats, and neon orange gloves, looking something like offshore fishermen preparing to be battered by a heavy gale. When they entered the room, one went to work tying the jaw of the cow to a cleat in the wall, while the other held it steady, petting the creature's coat. Then came the injection of anesthesia. Seconds later, the men jumped out of the way as the 800-pound cow suddenly keeled over on its side. Crouched over the supine cow, one handler yanked the animal's limp tongue out of its mouth, while the other stuck a long needle into the underside, and slowly injected the liquid virus slurry du jour. Their mission accomplished, the men exited, and took turns decontaminating, stepping into a boot bath of caustic soda lime water and washing down each other's rubber uniform with a wire brush. Humans had their own precise methods of arrival. Entering into Lab 101 each morning, they walked down a flight of stairs and through a one-way turnstile into a change room, where they showered and changed into blue and white coveralls and white keds. The air inside, under negative pressure, felt clammy and dry. In the most pressurized areas, it felt like being inside an airplane cabin. We sucked on hard candy and cough drops to keep our throats moist, remembers one worker. For the burly animal handlers who moved about in the lab, it was not unusual to take 8 or 10 showers, each supervised by guards, in a single day. We were awfully clean when we got home at night, an employee recalls. Showers were frequent. The Plum Island records for most showers taken per shift stand at 17 for animal handlers and 23 for scientists. To avoid a constant changing of clothes, workers often went about their business wearing only rubber boots, which made for quite a sight. The only way to exit the laboratory was through the anteroom, where workers scraped under their fingernails, a perfect hiding spot for viruses, coughed, spit, and blew their noses into paper towels, and walked through a one-way metal gate that automatically triggered the spray chute of rinsing showers. 5 showerheads deluged 7.5 searing gallons of water per second upon the occupant, as he washed thoroughly with hexachlorophene-infused soap. And no cutting corners, either. Skip any part of a bath and get caught doing it, says a worker, and you're out of a job so quick it's a pity. If a worker exited an especially hot area, he has to take 2 showers with 2 changes of clothes in between, otherwise it was just one, but that shower had to last at least 3 minutes. Even eating had rules. No going down the block for a bite to eat. Cold box lunches went into the lab through the airlock. Lab glassware, tools, and other objects went through walk-in-sized autoclaves, giant steam pressure cookers with two hot and clean doors that screwed shut and sterilized items going in, and decontaminate them going out. Workers were required to follow other rules even after leaving the island. A sign posted at the ferry dock eliminated any misunderstandings between the director and the 300-plus workers in his keep. Attention! You are now leaving a quarantine area. Avoid contact with the following animals: cattle, poultry, mice, deer, sheep, ducks, gerbils, hamsters, goats, pet birds, guinea pigs, rabbits, swine. Security was taken extremely seriously in the beginning. From the moment the Army transferred Plum Island to the USDA, the Aggies disclaimed an active role in military affairs. But they set up a first-rate operation with the type of security and secrecy worthy of a military installation. Plum Island's Armored Division consisted of 26 trucks, 4 buses, 2 carryalls, and 3 jeeps, which cruised the island's perimeter on 24-hour armed patrol. As employees disembarked from the ferry each morning, 3 uniformed guards, in dark brown shirt sleeves and black caps, examined each worker's security pass at the harbor gatehouse and checked off his identification number on a clipboard. A red pass meant the employee worked in a hot zone. It allowed him on the red bus and then gave him clearance into the laboratory building, confined strictly to the reds. A yellow pass allowed him inside the lab's outdoor compound, but not inside the labs. A brown pass permitted island access, but not near the labs. More guards patrolled the fences around the lab and admitted people into the compound at the lab gatehouse. Obedience of biological safety and security rules was drilled into the heads of employees over a mandatory 2-day orientation program. Entering a restricted area without a pass, entering an animal holding area without permission, or leaving Lab 101 or 257 without showering out were all egregious violations. Even minor infractions were verboten. The degree of punishment was tied to the severity of the infraction and meted out as follows: reprimand for the first offense, 10 days suspension without pay for second offense, discharge on the third offense. One worker remembers the second day of his orientation course. After lunch, we were escorted by Pete de Blasia, Plum Island's first chief of security, and he was held up at the door holding it for someone carrying out something, and he called out to us, "Stop!" But we kept walking a few steps because we were in direct rays of sunlight. I took a shortcut off the path and walked on the grass, and Pete ran over to me. He said, "Listen, I understand that this is your second day on the job. But if I ever see you walk on that grass again, I'll write you up, and after one more write-up, you're gone." In the 1950s, dealing in lethal germs required loyalty oaths. I hereby pledge full allegiance to the United States government, and State Department and FBI national security checks. Clearances at Plum Island were termed sensitive, meaning that most personnel had to be screened by the feds in a review that took up to 3 months. Sensitive positions included security, armed guards and full-time firefighters, employee residents of the island, those with access to red areas, animal caretakers, and those with access to classified research material. The case of Isaac Gaston reflects the seriousness with which the rules were then regarded. Gaston was a truck driver who drove from building to building, carting items and people all over the island. He had been a truck driver on Plum Island since day one, but now fell under the new security rules because he made stops inside the laboratory compounds. Until the driver received his sensitive clearance, Doc Shahin ordered his duties immediately curtailed to supply runs between non-essential buildings, far away from the restricted areas. The rules for visitors were simple. There were no visitors. Once the germs were uncorked, no visitors, no matter how important, were admitted on Plum Island. Nobody, said Doc Shahin to a nosy reporter, tamping fresh tobacco into his pipe for emphasis. Nobody goes just to see. He even denied access to Dr. Harold Cox from Letterly Laboratories, a Dedication Day VIP who had discovered the germ warfare agent Q fever. Cox merely wanted to observe safety procedures for a lab that Letterly was building in Uruguay. Though Cox's friend Dr. Hagen called repeatedly and lobbied to allow the visit, Doc Shahin put his foot down. No visitors allowed while the lab is in operation. The beaches in the harbor were also off limits. Doc Shahin moved against lobstermen and fishermen setting their traps in nets in Plum Island area waters. Often fishermen, pleasure boaters, and thrill-seeking snoops had to be waved away by guards brandishing shotguns, shouting through booming bullhorns from the silky beach or from high atop the island's rocky coves. Any picnicking boaters who set foot on the island had to sign release affidavits. I consent to any quarantine and detention imposed. I will avoid contact with. I consent in the event of emergency to be detained. My clothes and personal items may be held for decontamination, or they were promptly arrested, and their foodstuffs confiscated. Once, a boater's puppy dove from the craft to chase after a piece of driftwood and swam to shore. Because the dog had set its paws on the island and might communicate disease, it was forcibly confiscated by the guards, put to sleep, and incinerated. Rules were rules, and this one was clear. None of the animals that land on Plum Island are ever permitted to leave. The nothing leaves policy wasn't limited to animals. To prevent contamination, only humans, their street clothes, and their jewelry can leave Plum Island. Animal remains, spent vehicles, laboratory equipment, construction debris, paints, disinfectants, chemicals, biologicals, tires, radiation, and even food were either burned or buried in multiple landfills on the island. If it fit in the incinerator, it went to the charging room, if not, into a landfill's pit. Not even books from the island's medical veterinary library could be borrowed overnight. New York a telephone placed a dedicated truck on the island, and Ma Bell's repairman, Mr. Albert A. Abersmith, kept 4 separate sets of tools, one for each laboratory module, and took 4 showers a day. On the rare occurrence a vehicle absolutely had to come to Plum Island from the mainland, its top and undercarriage were sprayed down with disinfectant, and the interior was wiped down. Then it had to drive through decontamination wheel baths and sit on the dock for 2 weeks minimum before it could return to the mainland with a clean bill of health. And even then, the safety office called and checked up on the vehicle after the first and second weeks on the mainland. Some chafed at the innumerable safety rules and regulations, one called them ludicrously careful. Doc Shahin would have none of it. If you didn't like it, then leave. Take no risks, he told a reporter. We may be extreme, but I don't think so. It's better to be overcautious all the time than not cautious enough just once. Speaking of the laboratory's intricate constructs, a Plum Island scientist said, all of this planning and construction results from fear which is not to be confused with cowardice, but rather the real realization of lurking dangers around us. The laboratory attempted to tame those fears. It's the most complicated in the world, said West Point Army engineer Louis Genuario, describing Lab 101's revolutionary sheet metal air control system he helped design. And the largest. 3 jabbing his smoldering pipe at a reporter, Doc Shahin boasted, no other laboratory in the world can match ours for all-out security. Not Europe, certainly not Africa, and not even Fort Detrick, the Army's biological warfare headquarters. Shahin could make that statement with cool confidence. Plum Island was the latest and the greatest, an amalgamation of the best biological security techniques and state-of-the-art technology human knowledge could offer. So when the USDA opened the Plum Island Animal Disease Center amid so much pomp and fanfare, it really was the world's safest lab, as the USDA trumpeted in its opening day press release. Indeed, Germs didn't have a chance. Lab 257 and Part 08 by Michael C. Carroll. The disturbing story of the government's secret.